Hello and welcome to 21st Century Vitalism, podcast asking the question, what does it mean to be fully alive in the 21st century? And how can we best embody that aliveness while dealing with the unique stressors that are only found in this strange and potent time? I'm your host, Brett Kane. I'm a licensed massage therapist and mindfulness meditation instructor, and joining me today to help answer this question is my friend and fellow podcaster, Michael Garfield. For the uninitiated, Michael is a paleontologist slash futurist who, in his own words, is a midwife to a new myth, helping to articulate our emergent planetary culture and integrate art, science, and philosophy in a new way suited to our accelerating age. For those of you who are unfamiliar with his work, he's the host of Future Fossils podcast and the Santa Fe Institute's Complexity podcast. If you don't know the Santa Fe Institute, they're the independent research center which pioneered the science of studying complex systems. That was back in 1984. He's also an artist of pretty widely renowned and a musician who makes really cool cyber acoustic, live looped audio journeys that I have been enjoying since 2013. So in this episode, what we're going to be talking about is navigating collapse, societal collapse, in all the ways that manifests. So this is something that I find to be very important as we're in the 21st century, as a lot of the world's systems are starting to tremble underneath the weight of all of the momentum of the past 200 years. It takes a lot of work to be able to have a context for these failing systems in a way that actually gives us hope and optimism rather than depression and dismay. So I think it's important that as we address the work that is on our plates that was handed to us from generations prior, that we are honest and we look very clearly at what is happening, but also create potential maps towards a world that we can actually sustain and live in. So with Michael's work, primarily talking about technology and the evolution of culture and art, and complex systems, we really dive into a lot of how we got to this certain point, some of the evolutionary things that have happened with the dawn of the digital age, so how we've co-evolved with our technologies and how they've influenced us, and what happens when innovation becomes the issue and we can't innovate our way out of it. So there's a lot on offer here. Michael is an incredible wealth of resource on all things mind-bending. We talk about the idea of creative destruction. We talk about what exactly societal collapse will look like and how do we best orient ourselves in the face of these rapidly changing times, how we've traded community for the internet and how that's not inherently a bad thing, but we have to be able to balance these forces within ourselves and remember that we are terrestrial beings which have very terrestrial needs. We talk about addressing the global problems by stepping beyond our linear thinking and parenting in the digital age, which is something very boots on the ground that we can all learn from, the way that we allow our kids to come into contact with tools that are wildly known to manipulate our hormone systems and our endocrine systems and get us addicted through our dopamine. So this is a really meaty conversation. It's one that as I've been editing, I've been pausing and chewing on. I was here, obviously it's my show, and every time I'm listening and tuning in, I'm getting more and more out of it. For those of you who know Terrence McKenna, I've considered Michael one of the offshoots of that legacy, and it holds up. He's a fascinating person, and it was really a treat for me to be able to tune in and ask him some questions that have been burning on my mind. On just I got worry, I got concern, and bards such as him are able to really not throw away the severity of the situation, but to bring it into balance and harmony with a view that is actually very productive and uplifting. And I think that that's important, that we have folks who are able to hold all the complexity of the world and to be able to articulate it in a way that is digestible. I can talk, that's fine. So that's what we're going to be doing today, guys. This was a really fun episode for me, so I won't take up too much time. So before we get started, if you want to support the show, head on over to Apple Podcast, give us a review. Let me know what you're thinking and feeling about the episodes that are coming out. We're getting a lot of momentum now. I also do have a Patreon started. That is the most direct way that you can support. So that's going to be patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism. Right now, the rewards, it's just early supporter stuff. Once I reach a certain threshold of listeners, I have an entire rollout of different ways that you can engage with the show. We're going to be doing a bonus talk show called 21st Century Vitalism After Hours, which is going to be a lot more loose, a lot more lax. We're not going to be studying topics as much as I'm just going to be chatting with friends and getting into the free flow of expression that is always a lot of fun. So we're going to be doing that. We're going to be doing monthly, if not weekly, meditations. We're going to be diving into books together. I have a whole lot planned, so once we get the viewership threshold, we're going to be having a lot of fun together. Head on over to YouTube, subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Instagram, Facebook, any interaction that you do with the show will definitely boost the numbers. And let me know what you think, genuinely. Head on over to the website, 21stcenturyvitalism.com. Shoot me an email. It's all linked through there. Any feedback, I'd love to hear from you, how the show is landing, maybe some potential growth points. You know, this is a community project in my eyes. Me and I consider every episode a collaboration. You know, we're trying to get information out to you, the listener, that I think is important. So my role is curator. It's a DJ of personalities, and all of these perspectives that I'm bringing to you, in my view, are very important for living a well-rounded life with the unique stressors that we're facing. So I think Michael, this is the tip of his iceberg. He has so much to offer on the topics that we cover today, and I really encourage you to check out Future Fossils. It's a really cool show. Definitely mind expanding to the umpteenth degree. So yeah, check him out on there. They have a really thriving Facebook group as well, and I know he's also got a Discord. I know if you want to get plugged into his stuff, Patreon is his primary vehicle driving forward. That's where you're going to get a lot of his bonus content. And it's just an aggregate of all of his immense bodies of work. This dude is a factory of novelty, just pumping out just art and philosophy and music. He's a force of nature, truly. As you can tell from the music that's been playing in the background, which is his track Delta Pavonis from Pavo, Music for Mystery. So thank you so much for listening. Kick back, do some stretches, drink some tea, and open your heart for my friend Michael Garfield. All right, Michael Garfield, we are now live. I just want to start by saying thank you for giving me some of your time. I know it's early where you're at in the mountain time. So how's life? How are you doing these days?
I'm doing all right. I am a month away from my second child, and I'm in the midst of a really, really interesting summer program, the Diverse Intelligences Summer Institute. Jacob Foster and Eric Cartmill at UCLA, I met them at the Santa Fe Institute's Interplanetary Festival in 2019 and hit it off, and they host this thing that is normally in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews, where they bring all these people together to explore the puzzle of intelligence from every possible angle. And early career scientists and science communicators get a couple weeks in the cooker with each other, and just magical things happen. But, it's remote this year, and that has its perks. It also has some pretty intense drawbacks, but I'm grateful to be involved. And then, as we were discussing before we got on the call, after probably 17 years without a video game console, just at the suggestion of my wife, picked up a Nintendo Switch and have been initiating her into something that only superficially resembles the video games that I grew up with. So it's been an interesting kind of reintegration phase at the same time that I'm at it's funny how like that feels like the comfort of like the safe zone as I'm like breaking myself against the growth edge of all this other stuff, not to mention everything that's going on at work. So that's me. Yeah. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I just been doing a lot of meditation practice. I don't know. We haven't talked in a long time. I don't know if we've ever had like a formal conversation. I've just been kind of that guy on social media that's like, hey, good job over there for the past like decade. But I became a meditation instructor and I've been really diving into the world of Buddhism, doing body work and this podcast. So I really wanted to start off, actually first, before I had my like what I wanted to start off with, that conference thing that you're talking about actually sounds really interesting, the pressure cooker of studying intelligence. Before we go forward with what I wanted, I'm just kind of curious, is that specifically human intelligence, or is that kind of like the intelligence of nature and it as its own phenomena?
I mean, it's broadly construed. There are artificial intelligence people in there. There are people studying orangutans and cockatoos and whales and children, and even in human intelligence, the number of angles by which you can approach this is pretty prodigious. It's you've got language and psychology and embodied cognition and the physics of consciousness. I mean, they've done a really good job actually of curating a uniquely diverse group of speakers. I'm honestly kind of surprised at how much variety I'm experiencing in this lineup. It's something.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. It's kind of expanding the definition of intelligence and changing the way we think about it to be like, it's almost like this like self-organizing complexity that's already innate in nature that just manifests in all these different forms. So it's cool that we're having all these directed looks at it that incorporate every element of that. That sounds really fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to start off by asking, when I first came across you and your platform, you had this idea. This was back in 2013. I originally saw you at the Rootwire Festival, so that's my introduction. You had this idea that has really stuck with me, and I've kind of like brought up in different conversations when talking about technology. And that was that we are in this intermediate phase where as humans, we're trying to figure out how we interact with technology in a healthy way. And you made the analogy of like a baby with a toy hammer that was doing everything wrong with it before it could figure out what it was doing with the hammer. It was like sucking on it and like throwing it around. So 8 years later, with the amount of development, do you still think that that is an idea that holds water, or do you think technology has a different connotation than that now?
No, I mean, without direct reference to whatever I was saying at that time, I think what I was likely getting at is that evolution in general, which is a process of exploration and adaptation and optimization and creativity, and like all of these things are ingredients in that intelligence that we were just talking about, broadly construed as a natural process in which everything is happening. Our relationship to technology is fraught. It's iterative. It's bumbling. It's exploratory and quizzical, and only partially intended. And that's not unique to this time. I mean, that's like baked into like what it is and how it came to be in the first place and how we came to be in the first place. You know, everything is, there's a beautiful term Stephen Jay Gould and Elizabeth Verba coined this term exaptation, which is when you appropriate a feature for a use for which it was not originally adapted. And, you know, honestly, I think that this is probably everything in evolution emerges sort of spontaneously and then finds its function, right? And then is constantly rediscovering new functions. And likewise, everything, you know, so it's, you know, everything is constantly being jostled into a new context in which it takes on a new life and discovers, you know, and thereby creating an opportunity for the agents involved in this process of co-discovery to find new meaning, meaning being maybe formally something like what my buddy Artemy Kolchinsky at Santa Fe Institute talks about semantic information, which is like very specifically the information that is pertinent to the survival of a system, you know, and so you can talk about everything in your life being suffused with meaning. Well, of course, everything in your life is suffused with meaning because everything you're aware of is something that at one time scale, at one layer of this ongoing learning process, your body has decided is pertinent, whether it's, you know, evolutionary or developmental or cultural. You know, you've got, you know, you're aware of it, therefore it has meaning to you, kind of, you know, and then those things that do not, the truly novel, you know, the truly unprecedented things have meaning precisely because of the contrast to everything that you know. You know, what Gregory Bateson called the difference that makes a difference. So, you know, there's no escaping meaning in that respect. So yeah, I don't know. I think I'm on the same tip I was 8 years ago in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think that there is any like fail state that's kind of like potential with this kind of fumbling forward and finding new meaning as it arises? Do you think that there's maybe a point where it's like, oh, we've like went down the wrong evolutionary track and now we're actually like devolving? And I think of that primarily in reference, I mean, we had like the Social Dilemma documentary that came out. We all know now like the nature of social media specifically and how it has kind of hijacked like our hormone system and like the endocrine system. And now we're like becoming like super reliant in kind of like a gross way on it. Do you think that that'll just create new conditions for new potentialities? But do you think that this process with the speediness of how technology is evolving, is there a chance that like the thing could just explode in our face, or do you kind of have an innate trust in us being able to accommodate and adapt?
Oh no, it's a serious problem. We have, I mean, first of all, like cumulative cultural evolution is, you know, the recombinant creativity of being able to remix and modify and adapt and extend somebody else's innovations is, by its nature, a process that not only bestows us with this amazing inheritance, you know, that we come into the world and, you know, you and I were born into a world with mathematics and vehicles and language and, electrical infrastructure and plumbing and all this, libraries and all this stuff. But also the learning curve for all this stuff is immense, and the rate at which all of those things are interacting outpaces any person's ability to catch up to that. So I mean, at a very basic fundamental level, like, aside social media and like stuff that's been going on in our lifetimes aside, we are definitely Wile E. Coyoteing, like we're like well over the cliff and still running. Here, I think there's a pretty strong argument that humans have not been in control of civilization from its beginning. That like the very nature of civilization is that civilization is the dominant causal agent in this situation. That as soon as all of us are participating in it, then our relationships to each other are kind of subordinate to our relationships to civilization itself. But, nonetheless, we have reached a kind of apogee, or so it seems, with this stuff where the rate, and people, it's the thing that really scares me, honestly, is that how few people understand this. How few people get that we are not going to just be able to innovate our way out of this situation, because innovation is the situation. That what's happening is that we're in a crisis of creativity, of where creativity is begetting more creativity, and that is what is disrupting and destabilizing things, and that ultimately, I'm in the midst of writing a piece right now about how the childlike nature of the human being, when you look at the human compared to everyone else on this planet, all other organisms, it seems like the human has repeatedly has like doubled down again and again and again on childlike plasticity, warmth, openness, curiosity, playfulness. These are noisy, generalist, lateral strategies that have aided us immensely in our socialization and ultimately our domestication of ourselves. And you see this in any animal that we domesticate. Becomes kind of more like us in a way, which there's like a core kit of features that makes something interoperable, and that interoperability is is how we adapt to a rapidly changing environment that we have created. And so I think increasingly we are going to be called upon to become even more unfinished, even more playful, even more childlike and open-ended and metamorphic, and to accept a lack of resolution to some of these questions. But I mean, but at the same time, there are very serious concerns about the whole thing. I shouldn't say the whole thing coming down, because people tend to view collapse in very black and white terms, right? And that's not precise enough to be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
We need to talk about specifically what do we mean when we talk about things falling apart.
So do you think that is potentially maybe the current growing point that we really need to be accommodating right now? That's something that I've considered a lot in terms of like the way we view collapse and the way we view the future is largely dictated by the art that we're consuming. And I've said it a few times on the show, but I think especially like the 2010s, I noticed a lot of what I called like apocalypse fetish, where a lot of the media that we were taking in was, The Walking Dead was like the biggest show. What's that about? It's about like killing your neighbor and like not trusting anybody. And we're like very primed and ready for this, like very, as you said, it's not black and white, but we're very primed for this like black reality. Do you think it takes potentially leaning into that open-ended creativity and envisioning a new future in that one that we can actually model after? Or how would you say we respond to that?
Well, there is, working at the Santa Fe Institute, I have become acquainted with the oft-cited work of this Austrian economist, Joseph Schumpeter, who talks about creative destruction. He was somebody who thought about the evolution of technology and the way that technologies appear in such a way as to obsolete previous systems of technology. So when you get internal combustion, it kind of pushes the entire steam engine ecosystem to the side. It's not gone. It's just been marginalized. It's been pushed to the edge of the graph. And when that happens, everything around the steam engine also gets pushed to the edge of the graph, or like you can think about, just as a very simple example, we've got our current electrical infrastructure requires us plugging things into walls, but like Nikola Tesla wanted to beam wireless electricity all over the planet. And so if, were that to happen, suddenly we would have, thousands of tons of cables and plugs that we don't need anymore. And, what happens to that stuff? There's this displacement going on. And I think people are not taught about creativity in a kind of non-dual way, that creativity is an act of destruction, that creativity always requires resources. You, like me as a kid, my mom took me to the office supply store, and she's like, oh, it's back to school, and you smell all the new paper and the pens and stuff, and you're like, oh, it's new, it's great. It's like, no, it came from somewhere.
Yeah.
This is something that was made from something else that had to be destroyed in order to make this brand new thing that you can then use to, so it's just really a question of as we create more, what are we destroying in order to create more? And I think we're at the point now as a species that we have developed the rudiments of some sense about this, and it's just a question of how much we must continue to, like, how much this thing that's waking up to itself will undermine itself before it finally finds a way to regulate this process such that it can continue to mulch its own products without, like cutting off the tree branch that we're standing on, basically. And it's, and again, that's like too simple, too linear an example. I mean, I really do think that we are undermining ourselves in very dangerous ways, and we're going to, there's going to be there has been and will continue to be a lot of collateral damage from stakeholding non-human beings that had no say in this, but I don't think we're going to destroy the biosphere completely. I don't think we're going to destroy ourselves completely. And I deeply hope that we don't make it severely worse than it is. But at the same time, just to get like completely real, that, even the most conservative climate models now are talking about there being, hundreds of millions to billions of people displaced by climate change before the end of the century. Where we have the areas that are the major breadbaskets of the world, if in that economic term, are going to be uninhabitably hot, and the colder areas that will become super fertile economic zones are themselves currently carbon sinks, where because of the permafrost, they've managed to keep a lot of that dead matter in the ground constantly, and that stuff is going to be re-entering and so that even like that's going to amplify. And so we really don't know how to adapt to this kind of a new environment, and it's not going to be as simple as just moving things poleward, because at the poles, the sun, you got 24 hours of sun in the summer and no sun in the winter. It's like it's a different world as you move into the higher latitudes, and there are. It's not just about like productivity. It's also, when we think about like agriculture, like I recently interviewed Mark Ritchie of Syracuse University for the Complexity podcast, which I do for work, and he was talking about like plant enzyme activity and how there's a regime where at first, a plant's cells are limited by the amount that they can produce, but then it's limited by the amount that they can actually distribute. As you ramp things up, and then eventually, even if the distribution networks are all optimized, there may be so much entropy. Like there's a point at which, in the model at least, things are hot enough outside of the plant that photosynthesis runs into reverse. So it's like the plant becomes like clogged with its own photosynthetic byproducts, and so the reactions run backwards. So we're over the rainbow. We really do not know how to adjust to this stuff. It's not as simple as just genetically modifying things to thrive in a new environment, or we cannot think in those linear ways anymore. And there's going to be. It's funny as a parent to have to like walk this tightrope between yes, things are really crazy, but also we have some opportunity now that we never had before. We have the knowledge that we didn't, as a parent, I have the potential to do a much, much more informed and conscientious job of parenting in some respects than my parents did. I mean, I don't think I love my kids any more than they did. My parents did the best they could, and I thank them for it every day. But we have an option to sense things a little bit more deeply, and I have to believe that this, not, living in a world in which you don't have it figured out is a good thing. Rather than just assuming like my parents did, oh, well, the doctor told us this, and that was a world in which things were like relatively slow and cold compared to our world.
Yeah.
Where it's like such a thing as a clean, easy, final medical authority was, something you could like hang your hat on. And now we are exposed to the gruesome sausage making of scientific fact, and a lot of people can't hang with it. A lot of people are, like they won't get the vaccine because they want things to be like a done deal, like settled. And it's like, well, I'm sorry to tell you, nothing has ever really been settled. It's just a comfortable lie that all of us have been cruising on for our entire lives. It's like actually Santa Claus is real, but Santa Claus is this, the reality of Santa Claus is that Santa Claus is this like hyper object of people's beliefs and like commercial, like civilization scale processes, like all these supply chains and international manufacturing stuff, and like people's beliefs and behavioral patterns, and like that's a thing, that's a real thing in the world, but it's not like a guy in a coat coming down your chimney. Except in the sense of like maybe that being an extended metaphor for the way that this was sort of injected into your brain as a kid.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a hell of a rant.
No, that was good. That was juicy. I think what's really important as we're navigating, and I mean, it's really hard for a lot of people to even be in the same room as other folks who are like, hey, so like collapse is a potentiality. Like the way that we view life is not forever. There's a level of impermanence there. And I think it's just really important to be like on the nose with it and to be able to explore it from as many different vantage points as possible. Just something I'm trying to do with this show. It's kind of a buckshot of all these different thinking, because I think that that's like the best way to do it. And I think as we're priming people and kind of lubing up the gears for people to be able to like focus on this, I really want to quote Terence McKenna. He said something along the lines of, to be anything but optimistic is fatalistic. So I really like that you're able to like look at all of the moving parts of like, okay, so like we are definitely on the verge of some big happening. We don't really know what it is, but like life is going to change as we know it. But to act in a way as if we are going to be okay at the end of it. On the other side of it, it will be vastly different, but we are going to be okay and intact and whole to some degree. Like the level of wholeness that allows us to operate effectively in the world isn't going to be compromised. I think it's really important to also point that out, because otherwise people get really overwhelmed with the idea that, we might have to kill Santa off. This entire like system that you just explained, like that is something, who knows, who knows what, if capitalism fails, in its current state, this has to be something that we're like ready to take on, and it's also really interesting that you mentioned the ever expansion of like creativity and childlike openness. I don't want to speak for you, but did you say that was kind of the issue right now? Is that we're constantly doing that?
Well, I mean, I think it's an adaptation to the situation that we've created, in the same way that language, as we understand it, language as a syntactical form of communication, and a structured form in which we're not just grunting. We're not using one sound or one symbol to encompass an entire event, and then we have an inventory of vocalizations, each of which means a specific thing, and we've inherited all of these things as they are. No, what we have is a situation of recombinant parts that we can assemble in new ways, and every time we do, it unlocks some new terrain of possibility, and what Stuart Kaufman calls the adjacent possible, and the more of that recombination that goes on, the more the perimeter of the adjacent possible expands, and so it's this ratcheting thing, right? And so because of that, the possible is taking a more and more prominent position all of the time, and so it makes sense to lean in to the possibility. Maybe I do think that there is what my buddy Mark Nelson, who was one of the 8 people who was locked inside Biosphere 2 for 2 years, this massive ecological experiment trying to reproduce the 5 major biomes inside of a giant greenhouse in Arizona, basically.
Was Pauly Shore there too?
that was actually part of an internationally coordinated smear campaign against this project. But this was, again, Biosphere 2 happened in the 90s, when science itself was, understood as, you have a hypothesis, you run an experiment, you test this thing, you get a yes or no answer. It wasn't like what they were doing, which was this: we're going to enclose people in this thing for 2 years, 50 times in a row, and over 100 years we'll figure out all of the things that we don't know. It was something much more like the way we think about ecological research or artificial intelligence, a theory light approach to science, where that you don't know all of the relevant variables, or like what I just recorded a conversation with Brian Arthur about his piece Economics and Nouns and Verbs, where he says that if you use algebra to describe the economy, all your variables are pre-specified, and so it's not actually giving you an accurate model of the economy, because the economy is all about endogenous novelty production. It's all
GameStop.
it's all about this recombinant generation of possibilities. So you need algorithms to, there are certain things that algebra can do well, but you also need verbs to talk about something that is fundamentally process-based. And Mark Nelson says in Future Fossils episodes 93, I think, 93, 94, somewhere in there, he says that optimism is a yoga, because it's not about the ontological state of the world. It's not about the way that things are out there. It's about knowing that you are like one of these mice that an experimenter has dropped into a bucket to see how long they will swim before they give up. And mice with some hope swim longer, and mice without any hope drown. And so it's very pragmatic as far as I'm concerned. It's not about what I think is going to happen. It's about what I think strategically is going to give me the best chances of contributing meaningfully in a way to improve the situation. Like you have to be optimistic in a kind of instrumental or cynical kind of way, in order to really, do something of value, and in order to persist and keep racing. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I almost feel it's like this like opening creative tendency, this like demiurge of expansion and curiosity is, I kind of associate it really similarly to like the exhale of respiration. And then like the inhale is kind of like the conservatism, like the structure of things. And that's kind of like what like our political structure is based on, is like openness, maintaining. And right now, like when we talk about this idea of like perpetually opening and needing to do that, I also think of like, so like what are the structures that are like, how are we maintaining the actual structures that are protecting this kind of, exhalation, so like, yeah, I know. I just think that that's a really interesting thing, because I notice a lot in our discourse right now, and I think it's important that we're doing this, but we are questioning all of the structures, and I think that that's like an important impulse to have when we see so much like systemic injustice and things. But I just wonder how much structure can we start chopping away before we start to, we're like opening into this known future, but like we also have nowhere that we're standing now, which is probably good if we don't have anywhere solid to stand, because that does keep us more flexible. But I don't know, do you have anything on the nature of maintaining structure as well?
Well, I think the turbulence we're experiencing now has been well characterized by many other people as a kind of phase transition, to borrow a physics concept, and I think it is a literal phase transition in the organization of something from basically, like, if you think about, okay, let me give you an example. We think about ants, right? Ants, we tend to think of ants as there are ants with different body types, and each of those body types fulfills a particular role. And the roles are, they're born into it. It's like, I am this. This is what I do. That's not how it works in ants. Ants, as a distributed computer, basically, are constantly reallocating tasks. And how quickly they reallocate tasks depends on the maturity of the anthill, actually. So like earlier on, when there are fewer ants, there are, like fewer hands to do the necessary amount of work, basically, or fewer mandibles. So ants are reallocating to different tasks more frequently than they do when an ant colony is mature. And ants, like, you think about your brain is kind of the same way. As your brain ages, things get entrenched. The paths of thought that you walk are well worn. And so, I think if you look at, again, to talk about what this means for us as like, what are we as human beings? I think we are social for the same reason that ants are, as a way of collaborating at the scale of societies and civilizations, and that requires a fluidity or a mutability of us as individuals that's not necessary for like a badger. Like a badger just is a badger. And, but like at the same time, both humans and badgers evolved from something like the closest out group to vertebrates are tunicates, the sea squirts. These are organisms that start in their larval form is a free-swimming thing with a head and a tail, and then as it matures, it settles down and it anchors itself to a rock and it starts filter feeding. It loses the head, because you don't need a head if you're not moving around. You don't need to orient yourself in space. So if the environment is stable enough that like every day, when the tide's going to come in and I'm going to be able to just sit here with my mouth open and get fed, then you never really need to develop. You don't need to keep your head into adulthood. But like as the world becomes more turbulent, it makes sense to keep the head longer until you're a fish, right? And so there's this, one way of describing this decision point is the question of, in what ways is the environment stable enough that I do not have to make the decision myself, that I'm comfortable allowing the decision to be made for me. And you could talk about this as like Google Maps deciding the route you're going to take to work. You're going to let Google Maps do the thinking for you because you trust that the infrastructure is stable enough that you're going to like look at your phone and Google Maps is going to work. And that may not always be the case. It isn't. Just bear that in mind, that it's probably wise to keep in an especially turbulent world some reserve of geopositional awareness, so that you aren't completely screwed if the GPS system comes down, which doesn't seem likely, but there are situations in which that could happen, like a massive solar flare could do that. And and then there's the other strategy, besides like decephalization and what this paper that I love, Information Theory of Individuality, talks about environmental scaffolding and like what is the difference between a colonial organism and something that is more kind of conventionally understood as an individual, is that for the colonial organism, more of the information is in the environment. Again, like the landscape determines how often the ants in an anthill are going to reallocate tasks in large part. The landscape determines how much attention I'm going to give to the taxonomy of local flora and fauna. People in cities don't have the same kind of inventory of words for the number. Like they don't recognize as many trees or animal species or herbs as people who are more dependent on foraging. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and so the other leaning the other way is about the assumption of personal responsibility in some sense. It's you have to find your own food, you have to swim to it, but that enables coordination at a scale that is like different in a meaningful way. If you think about like a school of fish being in some other way, in many ways like the ants, in that it is it is collective behavior, it's a distributed computation, everybody's only locally aware of what their neighbors are doing, and the whole thing emerges out of this awesome, bottom-up, self-coordinated process. But ultimately, also, each of those fish is also responsible for its own reproduction. And it's responsible for feeding itself. So I think, we're just at an inflection point right now where those two strategies are going to be remixed in a lot of new and curious ways. And we're not going to completely lose the ground of the familiar. I mean, we're not. It's not like there's going to be this overnight qualitative shift into something completely unrecognizable. But as the ground beneath us morphs into something else, it's not one ground. It's like there's all these different ways that we are relying on stable environmental features. And some of those features, if you talk about like William Gibson saying, the dystopia is here, it's just distributed unevenly. The end of the world, it's not one world that we're talking about here. It's the end of the familiar, which is going to be different for everybody. And if you're, indigenous, or if you're a person of color, chances are you've been living in the apocalypse for centuries already. And you talk to Native Americans, and they don't have the same kind of concern about the approaching crisis or the ongoing crisis that settler descendants do, because the trauma in their memory is much more recent, and they're used to a world that is, repeatedly ripped out from under you. So, it's just, to live through something like that incents a different way of living in this world, and a different way of navigating its spaces. And so yeah, I think really my concern is primarily not so much about innovating new strategies for navigating this stuff as it is about distributing tested strategies for mitigating the amount of suffering and trauma that would otherwise happen when the rug is pulled from under people. How can we make ourselves as resilient or anti-fragile, to borrow Nassim Taleb's term? How can we grow stronger from the shocks rather than decay into infighting and substance abuse and all the other byproducts of living in the wake of a massive disruption to everything that we held dear.
Yeah. So what do you think, off the top of your head, is kind of the battleground of building resiliency? Do you think that it's found within nature? Do you think that, it's maybe not going to be like a technological thing if we can't innovate our way there, but do you think it kind of, as again McKenna said, like the archaic revival, do you think it's going to be kind of finding our footing on the earth as it is rather than in these digital spaces as this entire next generation? I don't know what your rule is going to be with your children in terms of like tablet use, but I know that that's like starting to be like a thing. Like kids are getting ingratiated into the digital age at increasingly young ages. So do you think it's going to be balancing that out with taking an herbalism class or like learning how to forage, or do you think there's somewhere in the middle there that, like, what do you think?
Well, I think it's about having a repertoire, right? So I think that people who deny their children either side of that spectrum are placing a rather large bet on the future. They're staking a particular opinion about the future. And for me, I look at throughout Earth history at periods of massive disruption, mass extinctions. Mass extinctions favor generalists. Generalists are not especially well fed in mature ecosystems where, everything is highly specialized and attuned, and everything exists in these very ornate symbiotic balances. But, you hit that with a meteor, or, some endogenous shock comes along, like the evolution of flowers, and completely transforms all terrestrial landscapes. And I think that's something more akin to what we have going on right now with technology is like flowers, that we're moving from, a landscape of conifers to a landscape of flowering plants, and all of the new symbiotic opportunities that those create, all the new niches that those open. And if if you're specialized to navigate a particular specific landscape, I mean, come on, like a lot of those ancient specialists, like the stromatolite, which is like this, this billions and billions of years old bacterial colony that now can only live in the saltiest parts of the ocean, these like bays in Australia, because snails don't live there. Snails just murdered stromatolites all over the world. There's lots of examples of little, places where holdouts remain, where living fossils like the coelacanth off the coast of Madagascar in really deep waters. They weren't able to cut it with, everything else that has evolved in the last tens of millions of years. But they've got this, they've got their nook, But if you really want to thrive in this kind of a, metamorphic landscape, then it makes sense to hedge bets. It makes sense to adopt what in simpler, more consistent, stabler times would be considered a wasteful, inefficient strategy, which is to learn to be more like a raccoon or something, and learn to catch as catch can, and so I think that the core competencies that I want to teach my kids are more about being able to shapeshift, essentially, being able to find their way amidst high technological environments as well as very low technological environments, to move in, to know how to gear shift from the very slow to the very fast and back. I was in my reacclimation to the video gaming environment this weekend, after playing several rounds of Mario Kart Grand Prix, I was like, all right, I feel like an X-Wing fighter. Now let's go for a walk. Let's go for a walk around the neighborhood and reacquaint ourselves with slow and physical space and flowers. And yet, my way of navigating my local environment now heavily leans on Google Lens, because that's the best way I know how to identify all of the native plants that are growing out of the sidewalk in my neighborhood, and all the cool, beautiful flowers in my neighbors' yards that I might want to harvest the seeds from and plant in our own yard. You can just point your phone at something and let it tell you what this thing is, because unfortunately we have, one of the sort of byproducts of building out all of these amazing systems of convenience is that, we have scooped out that mesoscopic human terrain in which we depended on our neighbors. And so you just ask your neighbor to tell you about all these plants. You lived with your grandmother your whole life, and your grandmother would tell you what all this stuff is. And my grandmothers are dead, but even when they were alive, they were 700 miles away from me, so I can't lean on them. But at any rate, it's like a yin yang kind of a thing, right? Where it's even in the very, very fast, find that kernel of the very slow. I'm finding that a meditative retreat into second attention, or like a witnessing state, is extremely beneficial to my ability to slay my friends at Mario Kart. Whereas, the same is true on the other pole. And it's not like a pole exactly. It's like a Mobius strip. But like on the other pole of the Mobius strip from that is walking around my neighborhood with, my phone in my pocket, ready to query the machine intelligence about the plants that I'm looking at, so that I have a better sense of my local landscape, and also better affordances, better handholds to explore the psychogeography of that landscape. It's it's human history and the way that people historically knew and navigated this space. I find that through a Google search, basically. So breeding this kind of comfort, it's like a magical toolkit, essentially. An ability to walk through walls with respect, right, and to change shape as fits the setting. And we talked about this a little bit before the call about like drone racing, and like actually like like your map of your body is plastic, and so you can actually map yourself rather quickly into the body of a robot, and then like be the drone and like race through a construction site, and that's damn near the same thing that practitioners of various medicine traditions have been doing for thousands of years. Yeah. It's very Saruman, like spying through the raven kind of stuff. So, I think a lot of to the sense of, to your point about this being an archaic revival, yes, but it's specifically in the way that Marshall McLuhan posed that, it is about a cultural retrieval in order to adapt to a new landscape. It's not simply about things reverting to the way they were. It's about reclaiming that which, or like reactivating dormant parts of our own inheritance, so as to have a full suite of capabilities online to navigate a completely uncertain landscape.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we are at an hour, and I know you have a time constraint, so I think that's like a pretty soft spot to be landing. So thank you so much again for sharing your wisdom and insight into this current day and age. I think the world needs more voices as balanced as yours, respecting the old and also embracing the new without thinking they can't coexist. I think that this is definitely the front line of what we should be doing. So I want to leave the last little bit to you. Where can people find you? How can they interact with you? I know you got a really good podcast, an online community. So, yeah, how can people stay in touch?
I would push people through the Patreon first, but simply just because that has an enormous hashtag organized database or archive of public posts, lots of free music and interesting discussions and artwork and stuff there. And it is also the best way to support this. This work takes many forms. As you know, I paint and I play music, and I host 2 podcasts, and I do a lot of online community development, and I write essays, and those things are all over the web. But I think the best place to start would be there. Of course, you can find Future Fossils and Complexity podcasts anywhere. Most of my music is anywhere you can find music. I'm working on 2 albums right now. I'm about to drop some new music here soon. I'm working on a painting that you can track the progress on Instagram. I have a Discord community. I have a Facebook community, both under Future Fossils. I don't know. Find the foothold that suits you, and I'll meet you there. And thanks, Brett, for taking the time. Oh, I do. I think if people are interested in this kind of sense-making, context provision kind of stuff, I'm much more active on Twitter than I used to be, and that's been a great way to play ball with people. Yeah. Thanks. Awesome. This has been fun.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it has. All right, I will talk to you very soon. Thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah, take care.
All right, my friends, that was the episode. Thank you so much for listening all the way through till the end. That was my friend Michael Garfield. If you want to stay in touch with his platform, head on over to michaelgarfieldart.com for a nice aggregate, or patreon.com/futurefossils. He's got so much to offer, so I definitely suggest enlivening your life with his perspectives, and the people that he's got in his circle are really, really inspirational if you're into the intersection of science and art. He really is nailing it, unlike anyone that I've ever seen. So, yeah, that was the episode, y'all. Next week, 2 weeks out, we have the one and only Morgan Mandala joining the show. So Morgan is a visionary artist that you've probably seen work from if you are in the music festival scene. She's incredibly talented. She's been at Electric Forest, just about every other major music festival. She's really something special, so I'm really looking forward to that. If you want to support the show, head on over to patreon.com/21st Century Vitalism. You can give us a few ducats. The price of a cup of coffee a month will honestly help create a snowball effect where I can actually make ends meet on this podcast. If you don't want to support the show through ducats, you can always head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, subscribe on YouTube, like us on Facebook, Instagram. You're no stranger to the digital age. If you listen all the way through to the end, then you're very likely plugged into the haps of right now. So you know how to support us. I appreciate you if you do. I appreciate you if you don't. If you listen all the way to the end, you're awesome. I make this show for you. So, all right, friends, we will see you in 2 weeks.